With his take, another guy who knows even more about Georgia politics, Matt Towery, the CEO and publisher of InsiderAdvantageGeorgia. Matt, we appreciate you Skyping in from hot Atlanta to us today.
Great to be back with you.
Well, here it is. Mr. Perdue prevails. What is the major takeaway from the Perdue victory?
Well, the takeaway is a little different than what you're going to read in some of the national media accounts. What happened was a series of things. Yes, the outsider sort of storyline sold to enough voters. That's definitely true. But secondly, Perdue ran a very smart campaign of bringing voters out to the polls, something which JD, we and John, we've talked about in these other Southern races and other Senate races that we've discussed. Does the GOP know how to get their voters out? In this instance, Perdue went for evangelical voters through some robocalls and other efforts. He had church organizations calling their various congregations to turn out to vote. And so whenever you looked at a runoff for a state house seat or a congressional seat that had a candidate who was viewed as more of an evangelical type candidate, their numbers virtually in terms of percentage virtually mirrored those of David Perdue. So that's sort of the secret story of how Perdue managed to get above Jack Kingston. And then, of course, there's that overarching concept that an outsider somehow seems to be more appealing. Sometimes that's been the case in some of these southern states in our Southern Political Report publication we cover, but in other cases we've seen incumbents go forward. So I don't think you get the big theme out of that as much as the fact that Perdue ran a very smart race in terms of getting his vote and his voters to the polls in a very, very low turnout.
That's right, Matt. They don't call it the Bible Belt for nothing, of course. I want to talk about something else that we discussed yesterday as well here when we were looking ahead to this race, and that was the turnout, what we're going to expect. You mentioned Perdue's ability to get out the vote with those evangelical voters, but this primary race comes in a season when turnout is just very low across the board. 18 million people have voted among 123 million eligible voters, primary elections to date so far. This, of course, from the Center for the Study of the American Electorate. Matt, what do you make of these very low turnout numbers? I mean, I guess in some ways this is what we would expect during an off-year, non-presidential election year, but at the same time, somewhat concerning, perhaps, maybe.
Well, as a guy who polls, I've polled in virtually every state in this country, certainly throughout the South, and in presidential years and in off years. I can tell you that I often cannot find a correlation between the turnout for primary nominations and the turnout in a general election. That having been said, I think Republicans need to be a little bit concerned that our voters may be taking it a bit too complacent. They see what you just mentioned in your news break, that the president's approval ratings are low. And I think there's just some general assumption among Republicans and independents who are leaning more in the direction of voting Republican that somehow it's a fait accompli that the Republicans will do well in their state. Unless the Republicans learn how to turn voters out literally house by house using social media like the Obama campaign did last time, we could see some big shocks, particularly here in Georgia, where right now the polls show both the nominee for governor, who is our incumbent governor, Nathan Deal, and the nominee for the U.S. Senate, both trailing the Democrats who have received the nomination for those two spots.
And I think Politico reporting today, guys, that this is the best chance now for Democrats to pick up a Republican seat. Miranda.
Trailing the Democrats who have received the nomination for those two spots.
And I think Politico reporting today, guys, that this is the...
Take it for granted that they're going to go ahead and come out to the polls. What do you think is the lesson there for Republicans to get voters out?
Well, I think the lesson is, and I was talking to a former U.S. Senator who's someone you would immediately know, who's been around the block a long time. He said to me this morning that he still feels like perhaps the GOP doesn't get it, and that we've been having trouble with turnout on the Republican side for a long period of time. The Democrats have not had that problem. Ever since we saw Obama run in 2008, they've learned how to pinpoint the individual issue for the individual to get that individual out to vote. I think the Republicans are still taking an elephant gun, pardon the pun, to try to lure relatively specific voters out to the polls. And these robocalls are running thin these days, and many of them aren't done very well. Social media seems to be a little clumsy on the Republican part. They've got to hone their tactics very quickly, or we could see what looks like a Republican drifting Senate control in November end up being one in which it's up in the air. And Georgia, which I might add, guys, I still think it's highly possible Georgia could see a runoff because it requires 50% plus one vote in Georgia to win a runoff in both the gubernatorial race, where Deal has gotten nowhere near 50%, and in the U.S. Senate race, where Michelle Nunn has plenty of money and right now is running ahead of the Republican. The Libertarians are on the ballot on each of those cases, and that Libertarian gets 3% of the vote. This thing goes into overtime. That would be December for the governor's race and January for the U.S. Senate.
Wow, that is an interesting scenario there. Let's talk a little bit more here about the numbers, Matt, because you mentioned some aspects of this that the Republican Party should be very concerned about looking ahead towards November. But if you look at a spread across both parties right now, I'll put this data up on the screen, there's been a decline for Democrats and Republicans since the 2010 primaries. Democrats, 29% decline, Republicans, a 15% decline. So what does it say to you that Republicans still seem to be behind the eight ball in terms of a get-out-the-vote effort based on those numbers we just put up there on the screen?
Well, I think one thing we have to consider is that when you look at that Democrat decline, that decline, I guess, is off of 2008 numbers, if I'm not mistaken, because it's since 2010. So they had further to tumble because they had such tremendous turnout in their 2008 race. I think the bigger issue is, and I've written about this in my syndicated column over and over again, we have a lot of really talented guys and around a long time who sort of all talk to each other. They're all the consultants and the like that we all know. The fact of the matter is, though, they keep telling each other that they're doing great, but they don't really come up with the new ideas that bring us to the new level. I mean, years ago, Richard Diggory, for example, he was the one who got direct mail going. JD, you remember those years? That was a new concept in the 1980s, but the early 1980s. It really was moving things. Then we moved into other approaches to get the vote out. But we're into a whole new approach now, and it just doesn't appear the Republicans have it quite now.
Well, no matter what happens with social media, you also have the dynamic in Georgia where you just had a bitter inter-party squabble there among Republicans. Michelle Nunn, who benefits from her last name, is sitting there well-funded, waiting now, 104 days between now and the general election. Is Michelle Nunn in the driver's seat? What is happening today to see Mr. Perdue try to gain the momentum?
Well, you know, JD, you're a veteran of this, so you know this well. In some instances, having a primary that, even though it's contentious, raises the two candidates up to a very high level of name recognition can sometimes be a benefit. I've seen campaigns before where there've been a bitterly fought primary and another guy just won the nomination with no problem, and everyone assumes the person who won the nomination with no problem is going to soar through, but they end up losing to the ones who had the bitter contest. I've seen it run the other way. In Georgia right now, Michelle Nunn is not defined, and it is assumed in Georgia that she's well known because of Sam Nunn. That is not true. Sam Nunn has relatively low name ID. He left the Senate in the 1990s, and it's the local, basically the media here talking to themselves and the politicians, convincing that the Nunn name means something. Quite frankly, David Perdue has a bigger name, legacy name, in the sense that Sonny Perdue was very recently governor. So I think they're both ill-defined, but I think the last names, for example, aren't as important as people think. Where the Nunn name matters is it's raising money all over the country, and she has the money right now to define herself. She was up with ads last night. I mean, as soon as this thing was over, she was running ads for the general election. Perdue has to catch his breath. He was on target. I saw him earlier this morning. He's basically talking about prosecuting, he's using the term prosecuting, the Obama administration record. It's a good start, but he's got a long way to go to define Michelle Nunn and tie her to that.
And Matt Towery, we appreciate your insights. I would imagine also, as we say goodbye to Matt and thank him for his insights, John, I would imagine that Jack Kingston has to get together with Mr. Perdue and they need to make a swing down Savannah way.
You're very interesting in this race because you saw a lot of the Tea Party folks lining up behind Kingston. Also, he's an appropriator. He's brought a lot of money into Georgia. Also, Saxby Chambliss retiring, a longtime Senate Republican there. His influence was a lot. Georgia is going to have some interesting changes in terms of what kind of bacon's going to be coming home to the Peach State in the future.
Well, you got to have bacon to go with peaches and eggs and everything else. Listen, your comments on the Republican primary and what may happen in the U.S. Senate race, we'd love to have them. Why don't you tweet them to us at Newsmax TV, #America's Forum. There's more to come. Please stay tuned.